She left a note on his kitchen table. "You don't owe me anything." Then she was gone, taking only her shawl, her silence, and the last bit of warmth from the house. On his bed lay the quilt she'd made, folded with quiet finality. And that's when something broke inside him. He realized he'd lost far more than he ever understood. He rode hard to the station, but what happened next will shake even the coldest hearts. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The morning after the wedding was windless and pale, as though the sun itself hesitated to rise. The wide windows of Franklin McGraw's ranch house stood open, letting in the scent of sun-baked dust and cattle, but no sound passed between the rooms. Downstairs, May Harper stood alone in the cavernous kitchen, her shoulders squared but her hands still. Before her lay a clean counter, a dry hearth, and a larder stocked with everything but warmth. She'd risen before dawn, as always, her body accustomed to work that had never waited for affection. She moved with a kind of deliberate grace, not slow but precise, measuring flour, trimming fat from salted meat, keeping the rhythm of someone who had never expected help and never asked for it. Yet now, in this house of stone and varnished pine, every creak of the floorboards reminded her she was a stranger. Not just to this place, but to the man upstairs, who'd taken her name without meeting her gaze. When Franklin entered the dining room just after 7, the scent of cornbread and bitter coffee met him first. May did not greet him with words, only a quiet nod and a gesture toward the plate already set. She did not sit to eat. She poured his coffee, then turned back toward the sink, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Franklin said nothing. He rarely did, but he noticed the perfect triangle of the cornbread slice, the crispness of the bacon, the eggs not broken, not runny. It was, in a way, the most thoughtful gesture he'd received in weeks, and it unsettled him more than he'd admit. He had expected neediness, maybe gratitude, perhaps even simpering affection. What he received was silence and self-sufficiency. May's presence in the house was like the soft ticking of a clock in a quiet room, steady, unassuming, but impossible to ignore. She moved through the day as if the air itself resisted her less than people did, and yet she made no demands. She filled the home with small signs of care, a folded blanket on the settee, a broom propped near the porch, his boots brushed and left by the fire. She left space where a lesser woman might have filled it with questions. Franklin noticed, even if he pretended not to. In his world, where respect was earned through land, labor, and control, May posed a quiet contradiction, a woman who brought order without challenge, value without beauty, presence without permission. And it was that very stillness that began, however faintly, to unnerve him. The barn was cold that night. Wind pushed through the slats like whispered judgment, stirring the straw in restless waves. May lay curled on a pile of old sacks beside the gentle warmth of the mare she'd fed with her own hands, the beast's breath slow and solid in the dark. Her boots remained on, her shawl clutched tight across her chest, not for warmth, but for dignity. She didn't cry. She'd long ago learned the difference between sadness and surrender. The insult, muttered carelessly by men with dust in their teeth and no use for grace, did not surprise her. What stung, sharp and quiet as a thorn in the heel, was the silence from Franklin. He had stood just feet away when the words were spoken, and he had said nothing, not to correct, not to defend, not even to dismiss. It was his indifference that settled in her bones heavier than shame. Inside the house, Franklin paced. The walls of his own home suddenly seemed unfamiliar, too wide, too hollow. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long shadows over the stitched quilt May had left folded neatly on the rocker, the same one he'd seen her working on in flickering lamplight, square by square, silent and steady. He'd assumed it was habit, some idle pastime of women who had nothing better to do. But now it looked like something else. A record. A lifeline sewn from thread and resilience. He thought of the letter she had wept over, the way she'd kissed it, not dramatically, but with a reverence that suggested a history deeper than he'd bothered to ask about. A history she carried like an old injury. Quiet, permanent, invisible unless you knew where to look. Out in the barn, May's eyes remained open. She wasn't afraid, nor was she bitter. What she felt was older than either. It was a kind of stillness that came when you had lived too many days unseen. She didn't hate Franklin, not even now. But she had stopped hoping he might one day look at her and truly see. And that, perhaps, was the greater wound. She would return to the house in the morning. She would sweep the floors, boil the water, mend the fence where the wire had snapped. Not because she was meek or desperate, but because she refused to let their cruelty dictate her worth. That night, Franklin stood by the window for hours, watching the barn, watching the storm roll in, watching the emptiness of his home settle around him like dust. The air at the station was brittle with morning frost, the kind that clung to the corners of window panes and turned breath into clouds. May stood near the end of the platform, wrapped in a shawl that had once belonged to her mother, its edges frayed from years of careful folding. She held her bag tightly, more memory than possession. In it were 3 dresses, a book of hymns, and the worn letter from her sister in Kansas, the one that had said, "You still deserve better, May. Don't stay where you're invisible." The distant thunder of hooves on dirt made the few townsfolk glance toward the rise. Franklin rode hard, the way a man does when he's chasing something he was too proud to hold gently. When he pulled the horse to a skidding halt near the depot, he barely registered the looks from the others. All he saw was May, and she wasn't looking at him. The words came out raw, as if torn from a deeper place than he'd ever let himself speak from. Each syllable struck the wood-planked silence like hammer to nail, awkward, uneven, but undeniably real. When he said, "You were right, I didn't see you," the truth hung between them like dust in sunlight. May didn't flinch this time. She simply listened. Her body didn't move, but her silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of resignation, but of testing. "Is this real?" it asked. "Or is this regret masquerading as revelation?" Franklin stepped closer, but not too close. His hat hung in his hand now, fingers clenched around the brim. For a man so used to giving orders, standing still was the most vulnerable thing he'd ever done. He spoke of what he had seen, too late, but seen nonetheless. The way she swept the porch in quiet rhythms, the way she healed the sick chicken without complaint, the way she mended his shirts with even stitching and no expectations. May turned, slow as thaw. Her face carried the weight of what had been endured and the calm of someone who no longer needed approval to validate her existence. When she said, "You don't owe me anything," it was not to absolve him. It was to remind him. Her worth was never his to give. But when Franklin replied, "I owe myself the chance to become someone who's worthy of you," she heard something she had never been offered before. Not flattery, not desperation, but accountability. And that, perhaps, was the first honest thing he had ever said to her. The thaw came slowly that year, as if even the earth was unsure whether it deserved warmth again. Snow receded in cautious threads across the plains, and with it, the silence that had once settled like a blanket over Franklin's ranch began to lift. Inside the house, something gentler took root. Not noise, not laughter exactly, but the sound of shared life. A kettle boiling, pages turning, the soft rhythm of 2 chairs creaking in the same room. Franklin no longer entered his home with the weariness of a man avoiding presence. He hung his coat by the door, boots lined beside May's. He noticed small things, a sprig of dried lavender in the window frame, the scent of cinnamon in the morning bread. They didn't speak much at first, but then came the notes. Short, uncertain at first, scratched on bits of paper and left on her windowsill. Your stew warms more than my belly. Days later, do you still read poetry? Then, I'd be grateful if you'd sit with me tonight. She answered without ink, by sitting. May would bring her sewing or a book, take the other chair by the fire, and offer no performance of gratitude. She gave presence, not performance. That was what made it sacred. When Franklin came down with fever that winter, it was May who kept the lamp burning low beside his bed, reading aloud from her worn hymnal or the Bible when his breathing grew uneven. He would wake, drenched in sweat, and find her hand resting on his, firm as a vow, not a trace of bitterness in her eyes. Only care, stripped of pride, the kind of care no man could purchase, no vows could demand. She gave him the quilt in March, folded over the back of his favorite chair. It bore no grand announcement, only fabric squares, some frayed with memory, others new and unfamiliar. Patches from old clothes, aprons, scraps of her mother's wedding dress, a piece of Franklin's own shirt she'd stitched without telling him. He ran his hand over the seams in silence, noticing, finally, what she had sewn with every needle stroke: history, forgiveness, choice. At the spring gathering, beneath paper lanterns and rustling barn rafters, Franklin held out his hand, not out of duty, but desire, and May placed hers in it, not with hesitation, but knowing. When the music began and townsfolk turned to watch, he whispered, "Let them look." And she did, because for the first time in her life, being seen felt like being loved,